بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الوعد الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته, and welcome to all of you, our dear viewers, here today on this podcast on poetry and the historical impact of poetry before Islam, during the era of the Prophet ﷺ, the time of the Prophet, the Sahabah, may Allah be pleased with them, and until today's age. I'm joined with our dear guest, Shaykh Adnaan Raja from Birmingham. How's it going, Sayyidi? Assalamu alaikum.
Bismillah ar-Rahman wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah, it's going very well. Thank you. How are you?
MashaAllah. Yeah, good. Thank you for joining us, giving us your precious time.
Allah bless you for having me.
So how's things in general? You know, lockdown, classes, everything. How's things?
Alhamdulillah, things are going okay. I mean, I suppose by this stage you get used to the strangeness of the entire situation. We've been in lockdown and then back in tier 3, and then I don't know about North Birmingham in tier 3, and so we're sort of getting used to this since March. We've had plenty of months to acclimatize to the strangeness.
Alhamdulillah.
Things are good in general. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So welcome to you also. If you're watching, thank you for joining us. Please, Assalamu alaikum again. Those of you joining and tuning in, we hope you benefit from today's discussion. It's an interactive discussion, so we'd like you to get involved. So please ask your questions in the comments. Please give your input, inshallah ta'ala, and please share the link and spread the benefit to those who are watching and viewing alongside you, inshallah ta'ala. Encourage them to join in. Before we start, actually, I just want to start off with a random question, Sheikh, for you, and maybe it's interesting to our viewers what your thoughts are on this. But somebody this week sent me a little picture with some scholars, like a group of scholars, and said to me, who would you have loved to have studied under or met from amongst the great scholars of Islam? So I want to pose that question to you, Sheikh. Among all the scholars of Islam, who would you have loved to have met or sat with and learned with, etc.?
There's
tough question.
Yeah, there's thousands, literally thousands of. This ummah is amazing. We've had thousands of scholars, and what you find in all of our scholars is that each one they're united by the field of knowledge and sacred knowledge, absolutely. But they still brought this unique, peculiar quality. Everyone's different. Imam Nawawi, for example, Shafi'i, scholar of Hadith, Ibn Hajar, scholar of Hadith, but they're two very different people. So I think for me, I am more inclined towards recent scholars, and if I could meet anyone and study under them, and I would give absolutely anything to meet this person, would be the scholar of India, Fadl Haq al-Khairabadi, Fazl Haq Khairabadi, as he's called in India, rahmatullah alayhi. He was a pioneer.
This is the resting place, Sheikh, right?
Yeah, that's his resting place in the Andaman Islands. This is where he was exiled to by the British following the 1857 War of Independence. And he looks renewed, because he wasn't like this a few years ago. And yeah, that's where he died in prison.
So what can you tell us about them that interests you so much or makes that attachment so strong?
I always say the beauty of life is in the details, right? So when we look at the details of Fadl Haq, or other scholars too, I suppose, there's something that makes them different to everyone else. They're always going to have certain qualities, certain peculiarities. And with Fazl Haq, he was, for me, somebody who embodied the fundamental aspects of the deen. So knowledge, tick, he had that, right? Knowledge of hadith, he was a pioneer in that. He was a student of Abdul Aziz Muhaddith Dehlawi, the famous muhaddith of India. The rational sciences, he's considered different to everyone else. He's considered a pioneer of logic and philosophy, and he really supported those sciences. He was a pioneer of the freedom movement, so he was involved in politics, and he fought against the British in 1857. That's what led to his eventual exile, and he was in prison. So if you think about it, he had knowledge, hadith, fiqh, tawheed. He's an all-rounder, and you rarely find people like that, I think. Oh, and he was a Sufi as well. He was the man of Tasawwuf. He belonged to the Chishti order. So yeah, all-rounder.
Subhanallah, Sheikh. I really like the way you've thought of that, and I think we do have more affinity maybe to the more recent scholars. And you think about it, the first names would come to your mind, Imam Ghazali. Imagine sitting with his company, or Imam Abu Hanifa. But what I personally thought, I reflected over it, and from my side of things, I mean, I suppose it is something I'm currently doing. Maybe it's affected me a lot more. But I was thinking that I would have loved to have met those actual scholars of the various subjects. Like, for instance, Al-Khawarizmi, for instance, right? He was, this is a stamp made, in his remembrance, etc. What made him bring all that maths together? Because remember, like you said, what unites them is knowledge and the faith, and this driving force to learn and benefit humanity at large. So I would have loved to have sat with these great mathematicians and scientists of the past. They're called scientists now, but I suppose they were scholars, ulama in the general term. They were polymaths, subhanallah, So I would have loved to have met this particular individual, Al-Khawarizmi, Zahrawi, these just is curious, like how they would have gone about doing their things. And they were the academia of Islam, aren't they? So it's a beautiful connection we have with our tradition. Anyway, our dear viewers, welcome. So that was just a little side note, talking about some of the scholars of the past. But poetry, Sheikh, where would we start in poetry? How can we take a look at this whole topic today, have a brief discussion, and help and benefit our viewers, inshallah ta'ala?
Poetry, Sayyidi, I think, where do you start with poetry? We should start at the beginning. So the beginning is, as a Muslim, for me, the beginning would be pre-Islamic Arabia, that arid desert land before Islam, before the Prophet ﷺ. That's where it all begins, isn't it, really? Because when you look at the later periods, India, South Asia, Persia, not the Middle East, but Central Asia, the poetry of these areas was in their native languages. And I don't mean native as in the major languages, Urdu, Hindi, and Persian. I mean dialect. People wrote in their dialect, in their local dialects and their local vernaculars. Saraiki, even, there's amazing poetry in that language. It's all influenced by the Prophet ﷺ, it's all influenced by Islam. So it only makes sense to start off in the region where Islam began, which is pre-Islamic Arabia. Is that?
No, that's I think I think it's very relevant to us, and not relevant to us. I think the whole world. I think poetry at that time, as maybe talk about, was something very pivotal, a very impactful or influential. So I think that and obviously putting the Quranic revelation within that context I think it's crucial to talk about that, and for Muslims and our viewers to know the role of poetry, the impact it had, and how it was a massive part of society. So yeah, I think pre-Islamic Arabia, the Jahiliyyah period, definitely. Just on a side note, why is it so important? What makes poetry, or the effects of poetry, or is it the rhythm, Sheikh, or what is it about poetry that makes it so impactful or influential?
So before even going to that, if I could just take a minute, I'm a big believer in relevance. So I think wherever we do as Muslims, as teachers especially, you teach, mashallah, as well, and you've got many students, and you're benefiting your community up north. And we have many other teachers as well that both of us know. Outside of that, we have people who engage in dawah, in the dawah field. Wherever we do, I think it's really important to maintain relevance. So wherever we do, it should have some relevance. It should translate into real issues that people engage with. So when looking at pre-Islamic poetry in Arabia, yeah, we could absolutely take this purely literary approach and see why was it so amazing, and how did that pave the way for, or how did that culture accommodate revelation and the Prophet ﷺ. But that has a direct impact on, and is relevant to today, the kind of challenges we face today. I mentioned Fazl al-Khairabadi earlier on. One of the reasons why he really appealed to me was he was a seasoned poet. He wrote poetry in Urdu, in Persian, and in Arabic.
MashaAllah.
And
Sheikh, I think you need to write a bio for us, for the wider public, to benefit from the life of this noble scholar, rahmatullah alayhi. I think it'd be really beneficial, because it makes me want to learn more just hearing, you talk about this noble individual.
He was amazing, and one of the reasons why I have this affinity with him is simply because of the relevance, the challenge he faced are not too different from what we're seeing today. So with pre-Islamic Arabia, why was it important that the poetry? Well, Sayyidi, as you know as well, the word non-Arab, Ajami, traditionally was a racial slur, right? And it really shed light on the mindset of those Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Hijaz. They were a very proud culture, and what made them proud was not their say trade or the GDP, because they didn't have much trade going on. Contrary to popular belief, Mecca wasn't a central trading post, right? At that time, in the international market, that was Yemen, that was the south of Arabia, who had direct trade routes with India. But what did they have that made them so proud? We always hear about this. They had this very strong degree of pride in their culture. They were proud of their language, their literary tradition.
Yes. I think that actually that's what they used the word Arab and Ajam for, wasn't it? The actual person who could speak eloquently, and the one who could not, articulate him or herself very well, and they considered the non-Arabs not to have that eloquence or that ability, and hence they had this sort of, self kind of respect, if you like, or it was a bit maybe self-arrogance as well, a bit of arrogance, but it was there, it was existent in that culture. You're right. I think you're really proud of.
Absolutely. So they were so proud of that. Every culture was proud of different things. In India, they had their own achievements. In the Western world, in Greece, they had their own achievements. These Arabs were really proud of their language. So why was that important? Because then the miracle that the Prophet ﷺ would come with would have to be such a miracle. Because the word miracle, mu'ajiza, it means to subjugate, right? So the miracle that he would have to come forward with would have to be of that nature that would be superior to the very thing that they were so proud of. This is why we find that other prophets, let's say that Musa, for example, performed what they call tangible miracles, right? Splitting the sea, for example, or the right hand. So now Isa performed those very tangible miracles.
Yeah, bringing the dead to life, the giving life to the bird.
The Prophet ﷺ, his greatest miracle, of course, he had these tangible miracles, but his greatest timeless, eternal miracle is a literary miracle, a linguistic miracle, the Quran.
SubhanAllah, SubhanAllah. So in the words, and that was something I was reading about the other day, Shaykh. It was quite interesting actually. He was saying that the words are forms, but the meanings are actually carried in our minds. So within the word form, there's obviously an aspect to the word form, and there's amazing things to the orthography, as they say. But the actual meaning is something we obviously, everyone takes a different meaning. Listen to poetry, you read the Quran, it can be interpreted in different ways. Sometimes the ayat are open to multiple meanings sometimes, and the hadith and that's the nature of language. And you're a bit of a linguist yourself, you probably can elaborate that on that a bit more today. But that's why I see in this linguistical tradition, when you say something, it can mean so many things to other people. And I think poetry had that impact. It meant so much to people that they carried not just the words, they carried the meanings within them. So this is something that I think you treasure that, don't you? It's like a treasure you hold within you.
So the poetry wielded a lot of power, and by extension, then the poets themselves, those pre-Islamic poets, they had this power. So each tribe they're very tribal people, and they're constantly at war all the time, right? We hear about the famous Aus and Khazraj tribal wars, but they have so many tribes and so many the Aus and the Dos, and so they were very tribal people. Each tribe would have a tribe poet. We have like the state television, right? They had the tribe poet who would cast poetry about their enemies, belittling them, lampooning them, mocking them, and it was just I suppose an effective means of propaganda.
Yeah. And then just Sheikh, that maybe we could elaborate more on that aspect of poetry in the Jahiliyyah period, leading up to the revelation of the Quran. How much of an influence was it? How much of a role did it play?
So, first of all, as a figure of pride, as an object of pride, first in that regard, absolutely, we know historically that they were very proud. So proud, in fact, that they had etched 7 masterpieces or 10 of that time on gold plates and hung around the Kaaba. And the reason was that when other Arabs, so the Qahtanites or the other Arabs from south of Arabia or north of Arabia, when they would enter Mecca for trading or for pilgrimage, the first thing that they would see are these 7 poems. It was a way of publicly displaying and showing off really a bit about their literary tradition. In terms of political power, so entire tribes could be led to war, and we know historically that they were led to war simply because of a few poems that were written by a poet from an opposing tribe about this tribe. We know about the story of, and Sheikh, I would actually like you to elaborate on the story of Imr al-Qais when he was traveling through the desert and he visited that man with the 6 daughters.
Maybe you could help as well. But from what I recall, it's a beautiful story that I think it was called Muhalliq, the person he was going past. I'm not 100% sure the name, but he was a man in the desert. He had several daughters, and he was finding it hard to find them a suitable spouse, a rishta, as we'd say. So somebody told him that Imr al-Qais, he's traveling through your area, so light a fire and call him to your. And that's what the Arabs did in those days. They lit big fires in the middle of the desert, wherever they were, camping out, etc., or staying, to signify to passers-by, come to us, we'll happily host you, give them a sign there's human life, etc. So it was a noble thing. Imam Busiri actually mentions those fires in his Qasida Burda as well. It's a beautiful passage. MashaAllah. So he lit a fire, and along came one of the greatest poets in all of Arabia. And the idea was that he was going to host him, look after him, and through that gain some notoriety and show you the impact of poetry. So as they were, interacting with each other, Muhalliq explained his situation and said that, I've got several daughters, not being able to get married, etc., etc. So Imr al-Qais said, no problem, So he ended up, and he was very honored to have been hosted by Muhalliq as well. So he basically wrote a poem and cast a poem in praise of Muhalliq, this man who had hosted him in the desert, who had several daughters, talked about his lineage, talked about his character, his morals, his raised his status, gave him celebrity status through some poetry. It wasn't after casting the poem and spreading around Arabia, and it spread fast. So the way of communication, or fast communication, or widespread communication, was poetry. If you wanted a message to get out there, you cast a poem, and obviously the greater poems, the greater poets, and the more eloquent poets had more of an impact, were more famous, like celebrities today. So that's something we need to understand. The poets of that time were like massive celebrities, like these big sports stars or movie stars or whatever people are into, right? They've got millions of followers on YouTube and Facebook and stuff like that, right? So that was the kind of thing that was big at the time. So imagine somebody with millions of followers casting a poem that reaches hundreds of thousands of people around the Arabian desert, Arabian Peninsula. So it's the story goes on to say that it wasn't a year did not pass except that all of his daughters were married, and married to noblemen, married to great people in the Arabian society, and that was all due to hosting. And that was one of the traits of the Arabs as well. They were very generous and honorable people, hospitable people. They really showed great hospitality to those who they who came across, and that was quite a big part of their character. So yeah, that shows you that story, the impact of poetry at the time. Yeah, Sheikh. I think that's very important. Thank you for reminding us of that.
So really, that one poem by a celebrity poet, Imr al-Qais, made that person's reputation really spread like fire through Arabia, right? Yes. And made him known, and people wanted to be connected to him through marriage or through some other means. If we fast forward a few centuries, there's an example of Miskina Darimi, a poet, who when he lived in Medina, of the city of the Prophet ﷺ, he was an acclaimed poet at one time, but then he gave up that celebrity lifestyle, right? So to speak, he gave it up and became an ascetic, a worshipper, and he was just in the masjid worshipping Allah Ta'ala, praying. And on one occasion, so like I said earlier, the beauty is in the details. So although the poem is simple in its language, the story just makes it amazing. He was there, and a trader came along to his city, to the city of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was selling equivalent of abayas, khimar.
Yes.
Women's clothing, right? He was selling that. And he had black garments, he had purple, orange, all these colored garments. And the women of Medina came out, they visited him, and they purchased all the garments except the black ones. He was left with the black garments. And this guy thought, now I've traveled through the desert, come to this major city, hoping to sell all my products and to go back empty-handed, just with money. But so he was a little disheartened. He went to the masjid. Someone told him, Miskin ad-Darimi, the acclaimed poet, resides near the masjid of the Prophet. Visit him and he'll probably give you a solution. Because poets were considered as guides from before Islam in that community, as advisors and as people of wisdom. And in poetry, they absolutely did that, right? They would encapsulate cultural wisdoms in the form of aphorisms and in forms of lyricized aphorisms. So he went to Miskin ad-Darimi and said to him, look, can you please help me out somehow, maybe do something? And Miskin ad-Darimi said to him that I can't do anything for you right now because I'm not really a celebrity anymore. I've given up that literary lifestyle. We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, no, you have to do something. You have to help me. I was told that you're generous, you're a poet, and you're a wise man. So what Miskin ad-Darimi did was write a poem. It's a famous poem, Sayyidi. I know you've heard of this, right? قل للمليحة في الخمار الأسود. Right? He wrote a poem, and in the poem, the opening verse was, say to the beautiful woman in the black garment, so black garment, what have you done with this poor worshipper? Talking about himself, right? He was just, I'm just translating it, he was just about to pray when you came and stood at the doorstep of the masjid, right? And you distracted him. So please release him for the sake of the Prophet ﷺ. When Miskin ad-Darimi wrote this poem, the locals of Medina thought he's actually describing a real woman that he was influenced by. And what was she wearing? A black garment. So within 2 days, this trader sold all of his black garments because the locals would buy them to be like that woman that Miskin ad-Darimi was praising. Right? This is the power of poetry in the Arabian culture of the Hijaz.
You know, on that concept at the moment, we've talked about obviously the pre-Arabian prophet and Miskin ad-Darimi, or pre-Islamic poet. But what I wanted to say was, how did ideas get conveyed within that? So obviously that's just an example of the impact on society. But what was the role of poetry, let's say, in guiding a whole group of people in terms of their akhlaq, their morals, in terms of their beliefs, let's say, or in terms of the societal kind of attitudes? Did poetry play a massive role in that in society, or was it, Islam how did Islam deal with that or engage with that?
Given that it was, so poetry was good business anyway. Wealthy people like Abu Lahab, they would give patronage to poets, and they would get patronage to write poetry just about their tribe, about the individuals. When Islam came along, suddenly the reasons for patronage changed, and the poets in Mecca, so when the Prophet ﷺ had left Mecca, the Quraysh would pay poets to write poetry against Islam. What was the purpose of that? Right now, in the 21st century, we might see that as a futile endeavor. How is one poem or a couple of poems going to make any impact on society? Well, we're speaking in an age of media, news channels, YouTube. In that culture, it was an oral tradition. They didn't have paper or parchment. It's really hard to get by. And there's always danger of it being destroyed by sandstorms and desert storms. So it's an oral tradition. They were very proud of their language. And the way you communicated messages in the powerful means to do that was through poetry. So there were poets standing around the Kaaba who were reciting poetry. The Quraysh would have their poet who was praising the elders of Quraysh, the people of the Daws tribe, Aus tribe, they would have their own poets. So when Islam came along, the Quraysh felt that one powerful way, we should use this medium to try and quell and suppress the message of the Prophet ﷺ. People believed poetry, they believed poets, they trusted them. So they cast poetry against the Prophet ﷺ, belittling Islam, but especially targeting him as an individual. How did Islam deal with that, you asked? The Prophet ﷺ, being a man of the age, being somebody who understood his culture, his community, and his context, the Prophet ﷺ countered that. with the same means, with this powerful means, and he appointed, Hassan ibn Thabit and a few other companions, and their role was to cast poetry now, praising the Prophet ﷺ, praising Islam, praising the message of Tawheed. And those same companions, whenever the Muslims tasted victory, which was all the time, they would write a poem to preserve that victory in the annals of history. The Prophet ﷺ absolutely picked up on that and utilized this medium. He was a man of the age, alayhi salatu wassalam.
That's beautiful. That so really embracing the resources and the media, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Of that time. And one of the medium was poetry. It was a massive one, if not the main one. And like you said, today maybe it's the internet or television or or these kind of platforms that are available to everyone. One thing that was occurring to me whilst you were saying that was regarding the companions as well. So they were the ones being trained or requested. So there must have been great poets amongst them, great orators, people who had, maybe, do you have any poetry from the Sahabah that we could maybe mention? I know Sayyidina Ali is often mentioned as very eloquent, but have you any references from the early sort of Muslims that can be? Even Sayyidah Fatima, I've heard, cast some poetry as well. Maybe Allahu Alam, may Allah be pleased with them all. So could you share anything that obviously you've come across that you think?
Well, there are a few major forms, maybe we could say, plus a couple of themes that that Arabic poetry at that point in history focused on. So we know there was Himatha, Ratha, right? There were eulogies. They wrote poetry especially about battles, about about their heroes. For example, it wasn't hero worship. So
say there was this idea of hijab as well. What's that called when you attack someone or you find fault? Lampooning. Yeah, that's it. There was that concept as well, wasn't there?
They would do that. So this was absolutely there. The Prophet ﷺ changed. You see, this is amazing. From the Prophet ﷺ, he kept that form. He allowed the Sahaba to write poetry. We know the Prophet ﷺ himself was able. He had knowledge of casting poetry. It's just that, as Allah Ta'ala tells in Surah Yasin, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala didn't allow the Prophet ﷺ to utter poetry the way it was meant to be uttered.
Yes.
Exactly.
Not taught him poetry, and it doesn't befit him.
It didn't befit him. It didn't befit because he had Quran. He was Sahib al-Quran. He didn't need to have poetry, but he had knowledge of it, and he encouraged the Sahaba sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the thing that Allah's Messenger did different was he changed the mindset of the poets. Now suddenly they were not writing poetry about their tribes anymore. We don't find the Sahaba doing that. Right? This is within 10 years, by the way. So this is amazing. 10 years. The Sahaba are not writing poetry about. They let go of their centuries of tribalism. It was ingrained in them. My forefathers, right? Our forefathers. They abandoned that. Their poetry was certainly about ukhuwa, brotherhood, the ummah, the mercy of Allah. And whenever they would celebrate a victory, it was never a victory of my tribe, a victory of Quraysh, a victory of people from my area. They didn't have this nationalism. It was a victory of believers, victory of deen. So the Prophet ﷺ allowed the Sahaba to maintain those forms, the ghazal form, the ratha form, but the themes and the content was different. Now it reflected Islamic ethics and values. So from them, Sayyidina Hassan is the most famous
mashallah,
poet of the Sahaba. He has an entire diwan. He wrote poetry about the Prophet ﷺ, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He wrote poetry lampooning the Quraysh. He wrote an entire poem about Sayyidah Aisha, Aisha, which I translated.
You translated? Yes, I've seen that,
a few years ago. We have poetry from Sayyidina Ka'ab, Zuhair, the famous, these are famous poets. The original Burda was by these people. We have some poetry from Sayyidah Fatima, very few verses because there isn't much transmission from her to the later generations. She passed away. But again, her few verses that we do have were really powerful. They encapsulated the sorrow and the grief that she felt at the loss of the Prophet ﷺ. So yeah, the Sahaba absolutely engaged in poetry. Ibn Sayyid al-Nas, very famous Imam of Hadith, Sirah, wrote on many topics. He has a book in which he compiled the names and the poetry of those companions who cast verses in praise of the Prophet ﷺ. In total, he lists just over 120 companions.
MashaAllah.
So it's not far-fetched to say that we know through tawatur, right? It's mass transmitted. It's undeniable that the Sahaba engaged in this tradition of poetry.
Yes. Just on a side bit, we're going to move on to more sort of the modern context and maybe move towards our age, inshallah ta'ala, with poetry. And please do get involved. Please do ask your questions. If something's come up in your mind, you want to get a clarification, you want to ask Shaykh Adnaan about a particular poem even, please do, inshallah, engage with us and comment, inshallah ta'ala. But what I was just going to say was, Shaykh, you and I and many of the teachers that you mentioned, we teach Arabic as well. And because you're talking about the poetry and the meanings, what I was thinking was, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, he mentioned the word diwan, which is where it clicked. He said that if you want to know the language of the Quran, then go to the Diwanul Arab. Go to the diwan. The diwan is like a collection of poetry. It's commonly used for that, but it means here the literature of the Arabs. You know, what was their language, right? The Quran is the Arabic language. It's classical Arabic, what the Arabs spoke at the time, what the Prophet spoke. It was that language. So just for maybe a little bit of insight into the importance of studying Arabic literature, poetry being a key component of that, in actually understanding the Quran al-Kareem and therefore Islam. I mean, how does that link?
The Quran was revealed in a particular context. And its initial revelation was in a very specific, a very particular speech community, if you can borrow a linguistic term. Those Arabs, they spoke a very pure form of Arabic. They didn't formalize the rules of stylistics or grammar till a bit later. Just the way when we learn English, we don't have to learn it through grammar. Right? We pick up the grammar. And how that happens is still a subject to debate. So the Arabs had within them this capacity to appreciate good literature. They understood what is eloquent and what is not eloquent. Eloquence can't be learned through a textbook. It has to be learned through experience. This is why we read on many occasions that there was a companion, right? So-and-so companion. He heard the Quran and he cried out, "This cannot be the word of a man." And you think, why doesn't that same Quran have that impact on, say, a person today in Manchester or Birmingham? Because the people are different. That Sahabi, before he became Muslim, he was an Arab in Hijaz, speaking a very pure form of Arabic, who was able to realize immediately the eloquence of the Quran in contrast to the eloquence of human beings. So that the Quran is revealed in that pure form of Arabic. Now, in order to then understand the Quran, we have to access that same pure form of Arabic. Where do we find that resource? What are the resources that we have? So we have Hadith literature, we have the Quran itself, and we have the Diwan of the Arabs, which is the corpus of Arabic literature. But the corpus of Arabic literature is not an undefined term. It doesn't mean Arabic literature from any period, from any region. It very specifically refers to Arabic literature that was produced from pre-Islamic Arabia to a certain end date. Now that end date is subject to debate. Some say it's the 4th century of Hijrah, and others say it's 5th, some say 6th. Generally speaking, the accepted view is about the 4th century. After that, there was a lot of contact between the Arabs and the non-Arabs, and there's a lot of non-Arab Persian influence on Arabic. So yeah, absolutely, we need, if we want to understand the language, not just the language, say, when we talk about language, people think it means just the meanings of the words.
Yeah.
It's not just that. It's to understand the stylistics, to understand how a certain word structure, a word order in a sentence can be different to another sentence which has the same words but in a different order, how the meaning can change. All of this is picked up from the Arabic literature, the literature of those people that the Quran was initially revealed to.
Definitely. So there's wa alaikum salam to Sister Sahabah, mashallah, one of the viewers that sent a question in. So I thought, let's engage. And it's exactly what we're talking about right now, Sheikh. It says, why has Islamic poetry become lost over time? Where have we gone wrong? Subjects such as Hadith, Nahw are emphasized, but why has poetry not been? So thank you for the question. We'll address that, but just to follow on from your comment and then to address the question there. I would advise the students of the Arabic language, and you know, those who want to understand the Quran, and you know, everyone wants to learn Arabic. we teach it. Like I said, I'm starting a new course in January. If you're interested, check the course out on guidancehub.org. Go and visit the website www.guidancehub.org, and we'll have a new course starting on the 4th of Jan. So in a 2 weeks time, subhanallah, like very close, or just under 2 weeks now. So yeah, please check that out. But again, what's that course about? What we're going to do? People think, Sheikh, you can learn Arabic in a year or two, and you've been through the process, and I have as well. And what I would say is, after 6 years, I realized I've started to learn Arabic. After 6 years, I was reading, like we're mentioning now, the literature, and I'm finding the poetry to be amazing. Like look at this sentence. Like I picked up Durusa Nahwiya, which is a book on Arabic grammar. One of the best things about this book is at the end of every chapter or section, it's got so many exercises that are classical literature. So the speech of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, or a line of poetry, and some Quranic ayat, like you said. So it's literally got a bit of everything. Maybe a line of Qasida Burda, a line of another poem. Man talab al-ula sahar al-layali. I mean, when you hear those statements, you just think, wow, it just has the impact on the heart. What we're talking about right now in terms of the poetry and the language and the meanings it carries is something so powerful. So my advice for the learners is, broaden your horizons. Pick up books of literature, pick up books of different genres, like you mentioned, Sheikh, not just one. Because some people just think, let's stick to the Quran and Hadith, which I think we can come into that question now. And it kind of, that's not wrong in a sense, although I do think it is wrong, to be honest. Let's just say it. You can't really understand the Quran just by reading the Quran. You've got to learn the language. I mean, how are you going to know what a word in the Quran means if you don't go and study the language of the Quran, which is Arabic, and then come and think, right, it's in the Quran as well, what does it mean here? And then obviously a lot more work goes into that. But you can't just say, like, this is the Quran, let's just learn this language. I mean, it's like going to the sonnets of Shakespeare and saying, right, let's try and understand these sonnets, and you haven't studied English. It doesn't work like that, Sheikh, does it? So maybe let's address this question. What's happened in terms of this attention and focus?
So I would add, first of all, I would add to that, if we're going to understand, if we want to truly understand any piece of literature, whether it's the Quran or something not so sacred, we have to understand the culture, the culture, yes, the literary culture of that community. It's like trying to read, let's take a work of Shakespeare that's taught at GCSE, for example, like Macbeth is taught there.
I did that at GCSE, Sheikh, thank you.
Yeah. So you realize, in order to understand actually what is being said, and that's not as old as the Quran, right? So if you want to understand what he's talking about, after getting past the barrier of language and Shakespeare's use of colloquialism and slang, you still have to be aware. The reader has to be aware of the cultural aspects of what's going on, isn't it? Or the Merchant of Venice, for example. Why Shylock, the Jew, why is he being portrayed in this light? It's because of sentiments, racist sentiments that people had at that time about Jewish people. That would be missed if you just try to read the text on its own. So to truly appreciate a text, one has to understand the culture. That comes through reading and accessing, literally going into the literary culture of that community. So for
there's a subject we used to study, Sheikh. Sorry, there's a subject we used to study as part of our studies. Like we used to go through the literature of the Abbasid period, the Umayyad before that. But there was one subject we had when I was in Syria. I'm talking about my studies personally. We had something called Tarikh al-Adab, the history of literature. So literally, we weren't studying literature. We weren't looking at lines of poetry. We were somewhat, but we were looking at Qus ibn Sa'ida al-Ayadi, for instance, this great orator of the Arabs. Samatun Dhatu Abraj, and his poetry was full of Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a pre-Islamic time. And we were looking at how the language was at that time, and the attitudes, and the focus of the people, and like we talked about earlier, the generosity, the chivalry they had amongst themselves, and why things were happening. And so historical context is really important to understanding a language, and especially when we need to look at the language of the Quran in a specific time and age. But maybe, Sheikh, what's your idea here? Are we overemphasizing Hadith and Nahu and these other subjects in terms of language, of course, not in terms of the importance of those things, and they're all important, but in terms of studying them, and we're missing out on the Arabic within our students and the growth of their understanding?
So in a traditional alim course, right, and I'm adding that adjective traditional on because it's seldom found, right?
Yeah,
In a
we have
traditional,
variants now. You know, the coronavirus has got a new variant. Right? We've got so many variants that exist now, some offshoots.
yeah,
Yeah, it's just crazy. Let's go to traditional. Bismillah.
yeah. So traditional, theoretically speaking, traditional Islamic scholarship would involve the study of the seven hanging poems, pre-Islamic poems,
Yep.
Diwan Hamasa section of that,
Yes. Evidence of
Mutanabbi, yeah, Diwan Mutanabbi as well. So there's a lot of emphasis on literature in that sense. In terms of today, in the non-traditional sense, why don't we see so much of an emphasis on that? This is a crisis which is not just not faced by Muslims alone, it's global. So around, other than some of the Nordic countries, what we find is that generally speaking, most education systems do not promote the humanities. There's a lot more focus on the STEM subjects, right? Science, technology, engineering, and
yeah.
mathematics. Poetry is
Uh-huh.
not taught in schools anymore. I've taught in a primary school, and we did not even once talk about poetic meter, for example. Well, the tradition, it was part of the traditional curriculum, but it's not part of the liberal arts. It's not taught anymore.
Yeah.
So
Prosody, right?
we have a lot of poetry being written today in free verse, but it's not written in on poetic meter
Yes.
or anything like that. So yes, literature and some of the literary devices are covered in English literature, especially at GCSE level. But learning how to write poetry is not taught in any school. It's not part of a modern curriculum anymore. So we find this.
Can you do some of that for a sheikh? They teach you that, don't they? Teach you the beats, and they call it the suburb, and in Arabic. I've studied the
In Arabic,
in Arabic. I'm not an expert,
yeah,
and I'm not
because
really that competent. But you studied
yeah,
English as well, haven't you, sheikh?
yeah. So they teach that in Arabic because in Arabic you can't write poetry without it, but in English now
Without
we
a
have this.
meter, yeah.
Yeah, without
There's no poetry in Arabic without a meter. Yeah.
you have to have a meter. You have to have the mizan and the bahar, and it has to all be there.
Yeah.
The suburb water. We need that there,
Yeah.
but so there isn't a much focus. Now, what happens is when there isn't a focus on a particular area of study,
Yeah.
the expertise on that field begins to dwindle, begins to wane, and eventually we end up in a situation where there are no experts left to promote. I don't mean people who just have studied and learned about how to write Arabic poetry. I mean actual experts,
Yeah.
experts of that field. We don't have them, and so there's no one left to promote that anymore. Plus, and why would poetry suffer like that? Because unlike Nahu, where we're learning about grammar and form, poetry requires a lot more than that. It's not enough to just know the poetic meters in Arabic in order to be able to. It's like in English, so we have the iambic pentameter, right? For example, just knowing what iambic pentameter is, just knowing what a foot is, or a stressed syllable is not enough now to write poetry. One has to have that life experiences, cultural experiences, a high level of thinking, something to actually put into poetry.
Has to bring something to the table, yeah.
Something, isn't it? So we need that experience. So it requires form and substance, which is a rare combination, isn't it?
Yeah, no, so good, very good question from my sister Sam, I think it was. Thank you for that question. I think, yes, we do need to address that somehow. And I think personally, my own experience, and I think Shaykh Adnaan can maybe echo it somewhat, it was a self-effort, if you like. I mean, I was a bit more lucky, I think, than Shaykh Adnaan because I was in Syria, and there is much more emphasis on language and poetry and the history of the language and the adab, etc. I think sorry?
Can I just add, I'm speaking about Britain.
Yeah, that's right. The context of UK.
So in the Muslim world, in South Asia, with Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Saraiki poetry, and Persian poetry in South Asia, in Iran with Persian poetry, in the rest of the Muslim world, Arabic poetry.
Turkey, for instance, yeah.
It's a living tradition.
Yes.
Yeah, the new poetry, the poetry is written on a daily basis in these countries.
Yeah.
You go online, you find new poetry every other day.
I'll admit something, Sheikh, and hopefully, I won't get attacked by the viewers or people listening. When I came back to the UK, I thought I was better in Arabic than most people, because I knew more poetry, because I knew more like stuff about language and history of language and so forth. And I'm no arrogant way. Probably was at that time, much more humble now, alhamdulillah. But I realized that, like you're saying, the UK studying methodology and the curriculum, let's say, and the contents of what an individual studies, it's just that time, isn't it? What do you put down? There's only so many hours in a day, and only so long students will sit with you for, and then you got to send them off on their way, and it requires kind of a sort of a lot of self motivation and courage, I suppose, from an individual to kind of go down that route. But it's definitely, it pays off. Personally, the more I've looked into literature, the more I looked into language. When I pick up a book of fiqh, I think it makes the fiqh easier. That sounds weird, how a poem of Arabic or a literary work of Manfluti or Sadiq Muhammad Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i would help you in fiqh or would help you in usul, but it does. When you read those books, you then feel that, oh, wait a minute, this is just simple language. Oh, this is what the faqih meant, because he's using a style of, and this is the thing, the fuqaha were experts in language. You see, the usuliyun, well, usul is language, right? They were the experts in language, and so forth. You see, anyone who wrote in the sciences, and even in other languages, like you said, there's many books in Persian, there's many books in Urdu and Turkish language, etc., that are based in that tradition of language and the literary tradition. So not learning that really doesn't empower you as much as it could. So just to move on, Sheikh, I know we said we're going to come more towards day and age. We mentioned and it is entitled today, a look at Allamah Iqbal, rahmatullah alayhi, Muhammad Iqbal, the great thinker, philosopher, somebody who I think you have a strong affinity towards, and who I've read somewhat about, and his works more so. And I think he's had a big impact on Muslim thinking around the world today. So is there anything you want to just transition through over Islamic history or Muslim history before we come on to Allamah Iqbal today, or should we just dive in?
I think we can just dive in, inshallah, and during the course of the diving in, we can elaborate on anything that seems ambiguous, inshallah. It wouldn't be fair, I think, to discuss poetry without discussing or even mentioning Muhammad Iqbal, who, by the way, I'm in no way an expert on him, his thinking, because this man was a legend. He had his own approach to epistemology, psychology, philosophy, religion. So there are experts out there. But absolutely, I think we have to at least
just sharing
share some ideas that he promoted through his poetry.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say then is, for our listeners, who was Allama Muhammad Iqbal? What was his education? If he's going to be somebody of importance, then what was his educational background and therefore societal impact? So maybe you could start us off on a bit of background of where he studied and kind of where he grew up, maybe, and his upbringing. In the few minutes that we have. Yes, sure. I mean, the idea is just to introduce, to maybe go over a few of his thoughts, like he said. But just before we mention them, maybe give our listeners a better idea of who he is.
Allamah Iqbal, in a nutshell, was an individual who lived. He was born in the 19th century, in 1877, in modern-day Pakistan, in Sialkot, and he's somebody who in his early years has had a lot of affinity to Europe, and so this is where he studied primarily. In Europe, this is where he completed his PhD. Much later on, this is where he studied law. He was called to Lincoln.
In the UK, has it? In England or in Europe, somewhere else?
The PhD was completed so he studied law in the UK, and he studied in Cambridge, and he studied initially in India, and then he came to Cambridge.
Okay, yeah, Cambridge, and then from Cambridge,
he was called to Lincoln's Inn. That's where he became a barrister, right? Called to the bar. He completed his PhD in Germany.
Right.
And really, that's a summary of who he was. In order to really understand where his poetry and his writings, and even some of his books and prose came from, we need to understand the context. So I said he was born in 1877. To be honest, until 1877 till 1908, these were his formative years. You really find a transition in his poetry, and this is where his most famous poetry was written. It's between 1908 and 1930, so this is 22 years this 22-year period. And this is a poetry which reflects his final, eventual convictions, both about philosophy, about religion, about politics, and about the state of Muslims and the world in general. At that point in 1908, so I say up to 1930 in December, this is where he gave a seminal lecture, and that marked the beginnings of the independence movement for Pakistan. But yeah, so between 1908 and 1930, 22 years, this is where we have the First World War.
Yeah.
You have the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate, right? The dismantlement of the Caliphate. This is where British rule was had completely engulfed most of India, if not all of India. It was consolidated, and there was no one knew that a few years later they would leave. At this point, it was consolidated. And this is a time period where in Europe there was growing nationalism, and we had the question known as the Jewish question, sometimes called the Jewish problem, that gave birth eventually to the Zionist movement. So there's a lot going on, right? A lot going on. And Allamah Iqbal was here.
Caliphate.
And he wasn't confined to just one area. He wasn't just in India. He was in Europe, then he was going back. And all of these experiences molded his eventual convictions that are reflected through his poems from that period, the Taran and Milli and the others, right? He's Dawn of Islam and he's Tulwa Islam. So yeah,
so that's important to understand, that his experiences would have obviously impacted his thoughts, and what he saw was happening to the Muslim Ummah, and what they need to do and where they need to go. And I'm not an expert myself. I'm not even that well versed in Allamah Iqbal. But one book I have come across and read into, and think I'd recommend it, and maybe you could comment on this, is this work here, Sheikh. Maybe you could talk about this a few moments before we go into the poetry, of course. The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. What would you say about this book for our viewers?
I would say read it, and then read it again, inshallah.
Again and again.
Very, very good book. So the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam are actually Allamah Iqbal's lectures that he gave, and they were compiled. One of these was given in Lahore in chapter 4, I believe. In this book, he proposes, and this is often misunderstood, he does not propose in this book in any way, form or shape, that Islam needs to be reconstructed. He's not talking about the religion here in this book. He's speaking about our perception and our approach and the way we handle al-Islam, the way we handle Islam. And what really he's arguing is that there are certain issues that Muslims are facing.
Yep.
He prophesied that there would be a new world order, and I'll come to that shortly, inshallah. And he predicted that Muslims would, as a minority in South Asia, face several challenges. And in this book, what he tries to do is address all of those challenges. The challenge of being a minority. Now, if you listen carefully, this reflects the state that we are in currently. So he addresses how to deal with being a minority. He proposes some solutions for that. How to deal with modernity, and he proposes some solutions with that. So in dealing with modernity, how would Islam work with modernity? He utilizes Shatibi's methodology of maslaha and the maqasid al-sharia at a time when those concepts were literally unheard of in South Asia. Right? He addresses in this book the similar question that we face today of capital punishment in Islam. If you have an Islamic government, what about these? What about hudud? How do we deal with that? How does that balance out with modernity? How does that develop? How does that sit now with the developing world, the changing world order, which was before World War I, it was a world of empires, Ottoman, Mughal, Prussian, German Empire. And after the First World War, now suddenly you've got a Westphalian nation-state system governing the world. Suddenly, you being a Muslim is not enough for you as a marker of identity. You now have to be Indian, Pakistani, right? Saudi Arabia in the 30s later on, right? Syrian. How do we deal with it? This was a brand new concept to the Muslim world. It didn't exist before this. Nation states did not exist before this period. So you can see what's going on and what he's trying to address in that book. This is where his poetry comes into it.
Yeah.
inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. So I think that itself, just at one point on the identity, I think today that's such a relevant point, Sheikh, that even today, I myself, and I think all of us, are we Pakistani, we British, that's the question they pose here, right? Where do you belong? Where are your values? Where are you going to live your life? Where your children will live their life? How many generations ahead are we planning for? Who are we? I think, he did address those points very validly, very clearly. I think he did, encourage the embracing of today's science and technology, and not to see a clash that some people sometimes do see, unfortunately. I think he was very wise in his words. But moving on to his poetry, where he conveyed those ideas, where he kind of expressed his sorrows as well, Sheikh. We've got to mention that he did, quite clearly mention the difficulties Ummah is going through in his poetry. We have a comment here. He says, could you kindly, Brother Umair, mashallah, could you kindly go through a brief commentary of Allamah Iqbal's Diyar Ishq Apna Maqam Paida Kar? And also there's Shakwa Jawab, which is a very, very direct and quite, some people may be taken aback by the language within Shakwa Jawab. But over to you, Sheikh. Where do you want to bring in the poetry of Allamah Iqbal today and the relevance and the impact and lessons we can learn?
So Allamah Iqbal is generally seen, and this is a negative term, sometimes used pejoratively, and I absolutely don't think it should be a pejorative. He's sometimes described as, because for me, I'm just going to let out one of my personal convictions. His idea that I'm going to talk about now is something that I strongly believe in, and I believe it's an Islamic view. So he was a pan-Islamist, okay? He absolutely rejected this idea of dividing Muslims on grounds of nationality, right? Wataniya, nationalism. He was absolutely opposed to it. How opposed was he to it? Before he left for Germany, he wrote a poem, which I'm sure you've all heard, right? Sare Jahan Se Acha, the one about India, about Hindustan, which was not modern day India, but Hindustan, unified Hindustan, which was all about praising. And he writes in these, and he wrote many poems of this nature. In one poem he says that, I'm just translating these, he says that every grain of the motherland is a god for me, right? This was before his journey to Germany. When he came back, he lived in the West. He absorbed, nationalism was on the rise, and it was a threat to minorities at that time, right? Especially the Jewish community. And so the Jewish community went through about 4 phases in trying to address this issue, the Jewish question. So there was the rabbinic phase. There was a phase where they tried to assimilate completely, get rid of any Jewish markers of identity, get rid of Hebrew, and just assimilate into the community that you live in. If you're a Jew living in France, become French, right? Don't be a Jew any longer. Just confine your Judaism to your ritual practices. That was an approach. There was the Jewish Enlightenment, and eventually they settled for Zionism. So he saw that. He saw the anti-Semitism that was going on against a minority. Looking back towards his own motherland, he saw Muslims as a underprivileged minority. Right? How underprivileged? I'll just give you an example. The 1856 Gazette of Rawalpindi, which was conducted by the British. I was reading that only a few weeks ago, and I found it interesting. They have the statistics there of educational achievement based on religion. The rate of Muslim women who were not literate was 100%.
Wow.
At that time, right? And the rate of Muslim men who were illiterate was 97%. In the entire district of Rawalpindi, there was 1 Muslim man who was in education.
Wow.
Right? These are the kind of statistics we're dealing with. Civil service roles were absolutely out of the reach of Muslims. Judgeships, district judgeships were out of the reach of Muslims. So he looked back at his motherland, and this influenced him. So when he came back now to India, he wrote another poem, and this time in there, he writes that because he's seen what nationalism does in Europe. So when he came back to India at this point, so this is 1908 onwards, right? But before 1930, he becomes a strong critic of not the West, not of scientific achievements, but of Western democracy, approach to democracy, and morality, and of nationalism. And so now he sees Muslims in India facing the same threat. He feels that nationalism is threatening to engulf Muslim identity, right? So in the 1920s, after the First World War, so after the Ottoman Caliphate was dismantled, he wrote his Tulu Islam, the Dawn of Islam, and tries to give hope to Muslims. And he says, well, look, the fate is over, but you know very well that a dawn is only born after the sacrifice of 1,000,000 stars, because all the stars have to vanish for the dawn to come. And so, yeah, this is a sacrifice, but we'll rise again. And he then strikes powerful historical. He invokes powerful historical events, Sayyidina Khalid bin Walid and those Arabs from the desert, right? The Sahabah, they were just Arabs from the desert, but suddenly they came out of Arabia, forming civilizations and so forth and so forth. So, in that context, he's writing this kind of poetry. And so, yeah, so he wrote this poem, and in there he says now that the biggest idol, right, in terms of idolatry at the moment is the land. He's talking about the idea of a nation state country. So it might seem a bit extreme, but again, we have to understand the time he's living in. He's living at a time period which marks a transition between caliphate and nation state. He's at the crossroads. In India at that time, in India at that time, there were several movements that threatened Muslim identity. These are often missed by commentators. There was an Arya Samaj movement which outright declared that Muslims should leave India or convert to Hinduism. This is the majority population we're talking about, and the Muslims are a tiny minority. After that, the RSS was born, BJP we see today. All of this was going on. So what he proposed was nationalism is not the ideology that's going to safeguard Muslims. We need to reconnect with our true forefathers, who are the Sahabah, right? Yeah. For example, Al-Bayt, Sultan Fateh, these figures. And we need to unite on religious grounds and disregard ethnicity and nationality. It might seem unrealistic or utopian, but as far as Allamah Iqbal was concerned, this has happened, and this was the status quo for 1400 years.
No, subhanAllah, Shaykh. So there was this idea that when I was reading this term, if you like, maybe it's good for our viewers to get a better idea of this. Was Allamah Iqbal pan-Islamist? This term is often used for him. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, Shaykh, if you wish to. I don't want to put you on the spot.
It means that I'm just seeing the comment about what does it mean, every grain of my motherland.
We'll come on to the comments, Shaykh. Don't worry. The comments.
And that's just caught my attention. Okay, sorry. So pan-Islamism means that he believed exactly what the Caliphate is supposed to be, where there is a supreme ruler of Muslims. There are no borders between their nations. There's a sharing of resources. And although each community maintains its own cultural values, when he proposed the idea of having a Muslim government in the northwest of Hindustan, which today is Pakistan, one of the things that he said about that was, and I wish I had in front of me, I could quote, but I remember some of the key words. He said that he would allow the Muslims to get rid of the impression of Arabs that has overcome and dominated them. He wasn't talking about Arab identity. He was really speaking about post-Khulafa Rashideen politics, Banu Umayyah and so forth, and the kind of Islam and the kind of culture that they promoted, which was a racist culture at one point. They were absolutely, the Banu Umayyah had this, is historically documented. So he absolutely believed that you should have your own individual culture and you should flourish, but ethnicity and nationality should not get in the way of the Caliphate and in the way of political unity. He didn't believe in political separatism between Muslims.
I think that if you read into the life of the Sultan Abdul Hamid II as well, very similar kind of approach towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, having read about it and taught it in our Isnad classes. When I was reading about his life, and there's a series by the Sultan Abdul Hamid, some of you might be watching it or know about it. I've not watched it. But this is something that I noticed in his thinking, that he was trying to save the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He did a great job, by the way. He was, mashallah, amazing person, carpenter by trade. But he had the same idea of it's not about a nationalist Turkey or a Turkish state, etc. And he was wise enough to actually abandon the kind of attempts to do that in his time.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he wasn't fully successful; otherwise, he would have lasted for much longer. But I can see what the point is here is that if we go to this nationalist, my group type of attitude, then that's going to bring down everyone as a whole and Muslims as a whole. It's that divide and conquer attitude, isn't it, Sayyidi? But just before we move to the question, Sheikh, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Maybe we have had a request for Diyar Ishq, Apna Maqam Paida Kar, and I mentioned Shikwa Jawab. But maybe if you could share whatever you feel is relevant or you particularly prefer to, of some poetry of Allamah Iqbal. And I'll just put up something I want to share as well, which you can maybe tell me is a true quote or not, is it correct, regarding Allamah Iqbal as well. It says, inexperience is only one source of human knowledge. So maybe something around the spiritual side of things. I don't know, over to you, Sheikh.
So inexperience is only one source of human knowledge. So he was a political philosopher. We can't take that away that he was a philosopher. This is what he specialized in. This is what his PhD was in. So for Allamah Iqbal, there has to be a foundation of knowledge. Okay, there has to be some concrete, axiomatic, if you will, bedrock from which we can, on top of which we can sit and then philosophize and explore and gain knowledge. Right? There has to be a set. So in Islam, we'll say that is going to be our major tenets of faith. That's going to be Quran and Sunnah. In the realm of philosophy, this is foundationalism. There are many ideas. What constitutes the basis of knowledge? Which foundational principles does all of our knowledge about the rest of the world stem from? Where does all this come from? And Aristotle had his views, and different philosophers had their own views. The Masha'iyyun in the Muslim world had their own views. The Illuminationists, Ishraqiyun, had their own views. For Allamah Iqbal, he was a ardent follower of Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi, rahmatullah alayh. And for Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, rahmatullah alayh, the central foundation of knowledge was experience. This is not something that's completely peculiar to him. I mean, this is a very common thing within Sufi philosophy anyway. But I mentioned Shaykh Muhyiddin because he's somebody who Allamah Iqbal mentioned explicitly, and also because I think he's the most famous proponent and voice of this idea that inner experience is really the most reliable source of knowledge. Of course, people will differ with that. The theologians within Islam differed with that. But for Allamah Iqbal, he took that on. And for him, inner experience provided a pivotal bedrock for many of his ideas. So when he was criticizing the West, for example, and Western, he wasn't anti-West, by the way. Make that clear. He was not anti-West. Mm-hmm. He was anti-concepts which we found in the West, and similarly, he was against many concepts that were found in the East. Also, he wrote a lot of poetry against the very clergy and the ulama of India. He wrote against the Sufis of India because he felt that everyone is just in a state of stagnation. The Caliphate is collapsing. The very fabric of our society is collapsing. And in his words, the Sufis were busy turning the prayer beads, and the scholars are too busy refuting each other. And there's no one to really take care of the Muslim community on a political level. And this is manifested. And so for Allamah Iqbal, I know I'm just going on a sidetrack here, because there's so much to say about him. All of these ideas are linked. So yeah, all of this stemmed from his experiences, real life experiences in the West, in Germany, what he saw with nationalism in South Asia. One of the things that he witnessed in South Asia was during, I mentioned the Arya Samaj, when they were on the rise and they gave birth to the RSS. These are extremist Hindu movements. The vast majority of Hindus would not agree with those ideas, but there was a movement to reconvert Muslims who had once been Hindus, especially in the rural parts of India, and they were quite successful. And the only reason why they were successful, according to Allamah Iqbal, was because some pious, great awliya had visited these regions, gave dawah to these people, and they accepted Islam. But then it was the role of the Islamic government to take over and accommodate these communities and to do something to help them consolidate their belief, but they didn't do anything. So in Allamah Iqbal's worldview, right, although Islam does address the individual needs, the societal needs, and the state needs, it has to begin with the state. It's a very important aspect of the Sharia, and this Sharia demands that it have this role of governance. How is it reflected in his poetry?
Yeah, Bismillah, share something, Shaykh.
So in his poetry, so we have his address to the Muslim youth, right? He's khitab, right? He's addressed to the Muslim youth. It's a very famous poem that he wrote, Khitaba Jawanan Islam. And I'm sure all of you have, anyone who's tuning in must have heard it. Eno Jawan Muslim Kabir Tadabbur Kiya Tune, you know, the famous one, right? I'm sure there's a very good YouTube version of this. I'm not going to sing his poetry, but I do in my spare time. And in this poem, when I read it, for me, as okay, I'm here as a teacher and so forth, but deep down we're all equal. We're Muslims. We're going through the same challenges. Sometimes identity crisis, other challenges. When I read this poem of his, he starts off by saying, "Have you, O young Muslim, ever pondered? Have you ever reflected?" And then there's a very bad translation of the next verse. Have you ever pondered what kind of a broken star you are in this world? What he's really saying is that you come from this rich constellation, Sahabah, Ahlul Bayt, the Sultan Fateh, Abdul Hamid, you know, you're from their stock. But the moment you've been oppressed, depressed, and suppressed, so have you ever reflected on that history that you're from? Because when we're in the middle of a challenge, it's very easy to forget the peaks of glory that once were ours. And he says, have you ever reflected on that? Well, what is there to reflect about? Then he moves on to the next few verses. And in there he speaks about those, I mentioned those desert dwellers. Have you ever pondered you're from those desert dwellers? Forget your genetic blood ancestry. Your spiritual ancestry goes back to those people who came out of the Arabian desert, this desolate part of the world, right? The Hijaz, which was so desolate that even when major empires invaded, like Alexander the Great, they didn't even go into the Hijaz, they went around it, right? And went to India. You're from those people who came out of that desolate land and suddenly conquered the world. They gave the world law and order, right? The Sharia and the welfare system, and they took care of communities, and they did all of this. You're from those people. He's just trying to reawaken people's hope and not let the flame die out in the storm that was happening at that time. He wrote another poem in the 20s following the First World War. So before the First World War, he had predicted that the world order was going to change. And what he meant by that was that the way society is run based on religious identity and the world of empires that we were in, like I mentioned, this is going to change soon, and we will see the 18th century Westphalian system take over, and the whole world will be divided into nation states. And that's exactly what happened after the First World War. So in the 20s, he wrote Tulu'a Islam, which is a collection of his 9 ghazals. I don't know what the plural of ghazals is, right? But and in there, first he laments what's happening in the state. These are poems which one has to read, but yeah, absolutely. So I think I've spoken for a while, and yeah, that's
really sharing beautiful gems, and it's really interesting to look at, listen to what you're saying about Allamah Iqbal's worldview and his response to that as well. He didn't give up hope. He didn't want people to give up hope. He felt like we've got so much still to offer as an ummah, and without a doubt we have. At the end of this ummah is the Mahdi. Isa alayhi salam is a revive. So we should never give up. We should never look at ourselves and think we're doomed or anything like that. But unfortunately, that may well have been the general feeling at the collapse of a caliphate, at the struggles that we now find ourselves in. But thank you very much, Shaykh. Really appreciate your input today and what you've shared. But let's just go through some of these questions. And if you do have any questions, please do ask. we'll try and address them as best as possible. So the first one, it says here, Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Is this book in English? I think the sister is referring to the Reconstruction of Religious Thought. Yeah, but it is in English. Yes, it is very much so in English, and several publications, several editions of this book are widely available. So you won't find any difficulty in attaining that particular work. So no problem on that one. And this is a really good question, Shaykh. I think this is really relevant. So which poetry books would you recommend that have his poetry in, that both the that include both the original language and the English translation? I think that is very relevant for our audience. You know, most of us are more comfortable in the English language, and we don't want to lose the original as well. So is there any particular works you could recommend, Shaykh, that would help us in that regard?
Most of his poetry has been translated into English.
Mm-hmm.
So most of his compendiums are available in English. Baba Jibril, so for example, Bangadara and all of his compendiums are available in English.
Any particular edition you'd recommend?
A particular edition I could recommend? No, because usually what happens is that the same translation is just transposed in all the editions.
Different editions, okay.
I say that so that's for most of his Urdu poetry. As for his Persian poetry, I'm not aware of any critical translation of his
okay.
Persian.
So it's just widely available if you want to get access to the English translations of some of his poetry. It's available. Jazakallah khair. And I think this is the question you were looking at, Sheikh, which we'll address now, inshallah. Peace, love and harmony, who's into the MMA as well. Assalamu alaikum to you. What does it mean, every grain of my motherland is a god for me? Very good question, Sheikh. How would you explain this obviously figurative statement? Bismillah.
Yeah, so it's poetry, isn't it? Like Rita Dove said,
Yeah.
It's poetry is the distillation of and the most powerful form of language. It was just a metaphor that he used. This is from his earlier writings. It doesn't reflect his ideas later on in life. Okay, it was just a metaphor to show the grandeur and the sanctity of one's motherland. This is an idea that he forewent and he abandoned following 1908.
Which you mentioned quite clearly today. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair to Haris, mashallah, for tuning in. Barakallah feek. Sister Hind, mashallah, one of your students, I believe. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. She's asking, according to Allamah Iqbal, rahmatullahi alayhi's thought, what's the role of Islam in a human's life? Very good question. Tfaddal, Shaykh. Islam's role in our lives.
Allamah Iqbal's view on this is a very traditional orthodox view. So he believes that Islam addresses an individual needs. Now, individual needs here means morality and ethics, but beyond that, divine communion and intimacy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which comes through experience. So he absolutely believes that Islam teaches us that this is like the Ghazalian form. The narrative of Islam that Imam al-Ghazali puts forward in his Ihya, right? Imam Ghazali interprets the entire Sharia from the lens of tasawwuf and spirituality and experiencing God in his Ihya. Allamah Iqbal doesn't reject that, but he goes beyond that, right? And he believes that after addressing those individual needs, what's the purpose of an individual undergoing that refinement? It's to serve a greater cause, and that greater cause is society, the fabric of society, community, and this is where Islam really comes into its own, and it allows it's a universal, I would say, a universal instrument which Muslims can use and utilize and gather upon and unite under in order to then forge a society which serves not only Muslim needs, he absolutely never promoted that, but it serves the needs of human beings. So what is the role, in a summary, what is the role of Islam in a human being's life for Muhammad Iqbal? In my reading of him, its role is to have a better society.
For us all to live in peace and harmony.
For all people to forge a better society. And that's only going to happen through Islam and the Sharia as per Iqbal.
MashaAllah. So here's a question from Sister Ali. It says, Assalamu alaikum salam. Hope you're well, hope you're well too. Is there a difference between ghazals and shairi? I think is there. Could you explain what these two terms mean, maybe for everyone?
Okay. So if I just can add to the previous questions, one more. So
Bismillah.
So Iqbal did believe that Islam addresses all of our individual needs, psychological needs, ethical needs, moral needs, intellectual needs. He believed the Sharia covers everything, and this is why we don't need foreign ideologies such as nationalism, okay, or qawmiya or wataniya. We believe we don't need it.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, the Shari and Ghazal. Shari just means
Yeah.
poetry. Ghazal is a type of poem. It has origins in pre-Islamic Arabia, believe it or not. But those ghazals of those pre-Islamic Arabs are very different to the type of ghazal that we know today. The ghazal form was then adopted by South Asians, by Persian poets,
Persians,
and they completely transformed it. And the most famous ghazals today are from South Asia, and they are the most famous for a very good reason, because they're some of the best, if not the best, ghazals on earth.
I think Brother Omer wants us to do another show. Basically, he says, could you please share a few sentiments from his life regarding his passion for poetry and love for the Prophet ﷺ, in cons such as his childhood memory of his father, rahmatullah alayhi, and the pauper at his door, and the man singing Ajsik Mitran in the alleyway, mashallah, and also his relationship with Maulana Rumi, which I think is maybe something you just mentioned the last point. But anything you want to touch on there, Sheikh, from what you just said?
So for Allamah Iqbal, he appreciated all of the Sufi poets, Sheikh Sadi or Rumi, but because of his own worldview, right, and the approach that he took, he held a lot of affinity with, and he looked up to as a role model to another Sufi sheikh who encountered similar challenges, and that was Mujaddid al-Thani Shaykh Sirhindi, rahmatullah alayhi.
Rahmatullah alayhi.
And so he wrote a poetry about Shaykh Sirhindi. He visited his shrine, and he is considered by later scholars as a reviver and a reflection of Mujaddid al-Thani rahmatullah alayhi, because Mujaddid al-Thani was dealing with Deen Ilahi of Akbar, which was a perennialist faith, which he wanted to spread throughout India. And of course, we know Mujaddid al-Thani countered that. And Allamah Iqbal saw that challenge very similar to the kind of challenges he was facing, except instead of having Deen Ilahi as a challenge, he was facing the challenge of nationalism. So yeah, he was really into the Sufi masters. He even had correspondence with Pir Mehdi Shah Sahib rahmatullah alayhi. He Pisa passed away before he could reply, but Allamah Iqbal's letter to him was about, well, he was on his way to Cambridge to deliver a lecture on the nature of time and space. So in his letter, which you can find, there's a copy of his handwritten letter online. In that letter, he asks Pisa, well, he first says that I visited Cambridge a couple of years ago, and I spoke about Shaykh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's conceptualization of time and space, and the people really liked it. And now I want to expand on that, but I don't know of anyone who holds expertise on Shaykh Muhyiddin the way you do in all of India. So can you please help me with this and offer me some guidance as to what does Shaykh Muhyiddin say about the nature of time and space? But Pisa passed away before he could reply. In terms of his love for the Prophet ﷺ, so like I said, Allamah Iqbal saw himself as facing similar challenges to Mujaddid al-Thani. What was the biggest challenge that Mujaddid al-Thani rahmatullah alayhi faced? Well, it was the perennialist faith which was promoted by Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great formulated his own religion called Deen Ilahi, called Deen Akbar, the greatest religion or the godly religion. And what the idea was is that India is divided amongst religious lines. You have Muslims, you have Hindus, you have Jains, Buddhists. And so the way to birth social cohesion in this environment is to unite upon a creed which suits everyone. And that creed is belief in God. So he believed that, okay, we may have different names for God, Allah, or someone might call him Mahatma, or the Purusha, or something like that. But essentially everyone believes in God. This is his idea. The root problem is prophethood, Nubuwah, Sharia. You have prophethood. Because of that, you have different Sharias. People worship different ways. They have different approaches to life. That's what really causes the problem. So let's just get rid of Risala, Nubuwah. Let's get rid of the office of prophethood and stick to God. Because of that, Allamah Iqbal saw himself as facing a similar challenge, and he wrote poetry about this in Persian, saying that without the office of prophethood, there is no Islam. Mm-hmm. There is no Islam. If you take Hadith away, these are his words. If you take Hadith away, take the Prophet ﷺ away, there's no Islam. You're left with the Quran, which you can then interpret however you like, in whichever way you like, and take it into any direction that you like. So he refers to the Prophet ﷺ with many titles. On one occasion, he refers to, in that address to the young Muslims, he refers to the Prophet ﷺ as Mir Karwa, as the leader of the caravan. And he says that we have nothing to fear, knowing that we have this Ahmad to lead the caravan. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. Beautiful stuff. So it says here, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Do we need to have understanding of tasawwuf to understand poetry, or do the two go hand in hand? Bismillah.
It really depends on which poetry. If we're speaking about the poetry of Allamah Iqbal, he was a Sufi. So absolutely he drew on concepts within tasawwuf, sometimes very complicated concepts of tasawwuf. If we were talking about some of the classical poets like Rumi, Sheikh Sadi, Hafiz, for example, you can put Kabir in there if you want. I'm not really too sure about him, but they absolutely utilized. They were all Sufis, and they're all some of the best poetry. So it's important.
Yeah,
if it's poetry of another kind, then you don't need to.
You don't need it, obviously. Then it's a similar kind of question. Says, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Like the Islamic sciences, do we need to have a teacher or guide to guide our understanding? I'm guessing to guide our understanding in poetry. So in terms of learning poetry and having an instructor in poetry, Sheikh, what's the guidance on that?
I think the question is about, when we're reading poetry, do we need a teacher to refer back to so that we don't miss some of the concept? And I think it depends what kind of poetry you're reading. So if you want to read some of this poetry of the Sufis, I think a lot of it will seem maybe inaccessible without. If you're reading Arabic poetry and you come across Sheikh Mustafa al-Alawi's Danawtu min Hayyi Layla, right? How are you going to interpret that unless you know who Layla is here? You would think that the Sheikh is describing a woman, but he's not. So I drew closer to the tent of Layla, and he speaks about this. And it's like if you take a literal poetry, can't be read literally. So especially Sufi poetry, it's lethal if you read it literally. So you do need a teacher, absolutely. It can be a teacher, your own research. Poetry should be enjoyed and not made too much into a rigorous science. Should enjoy it.
MashaAllah. So here, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for this beautiful enlightening session. What is your favorite poem or one of your favorites by Allamah Iqbal rahmatullahi, and why? I'll say quickly, mine is probably Shikwa wa Jawab, because I'm that kind of person. I love saying it all. I love putting it out there, even if it's controversial. And I think Allamah Iqbal in that poem didn't hold back. And it was a bit of a shocking one. Some people, when they hear that poem, they're quite surprised at the language. For me, that's probably one I really have a liking to, because he addresses serious issues and brings it to the forefront in a very sort of, I don't know if that's the right word, dramatic kind of way as well. But yourself, Sheikh, anything you'd want to share, a particular poem or favorite, or just everything, isn't it?
I enjoy all of his poetry. I like his poetry about the Prophet ﷺ, especially. Lawh bitu, qalam bitu. It's a very famous poem by him. It's about the Prophet ﷺ, in which he refers to the Prophet as the tablet. You are the tablet, you are the pen. I like that. But the poem that I listen to most often, and perhaps it's one of my favorites of Allamah Iqbal, is his Tarana Milli.
Okay, mashallah.
And that's why I like it.
And then finally, Sheikh, I think it's the last one we'll have for today. Thank you to everyone for your questions and participating. Can you explain the concept of hoodie in simple terms, if possible? I can't, so I'm leaving it to you, Sheikh.
So, Amrin, since you're one of our students,
mashallah,
I can be a bit informal and say I can't explain the concept of hoodie, because there are entire books written on the concept of hoodie and the falsafa of hoodie and what Allamah Iqbal meant by that. And I think we're still discovering it. So I can't go into, in the next few seconds, I can't go into it, but basically it's the concept of the self. But when Allamah Iqbal speaks about the self, he's speaking about an empowered self. Okay.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Appreciate your support. Please do share with others. Please do suggest topics for the future. Thank you to Shaykh Adnaan for his time and enlightening us in such a relevant topic today, and in particular on Allamah Iqbal, but also on the poetry, Arabic language, learning itself. I think it's been quite an amazing and informative and beneficial session. So thank you, Sheikh. Any final words from yourself?
Just one final word is the best way to understand poetry is to read it, engage with it. You'll see that poetry really widens a person's understanding, and it's a way of dipping your hands into other cultures and other worlds. So inshallah, Allah give you a tawfiq, give me tawfiq. Shaykh Waseem, thank you for having me. It's been
problem.
a pleasure.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair. Thank you. And to echo those words of Shaykh Adnaan, I think read in general, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, poetry, like Shaykh Adnaan said, its own flavor. As Shaykh Insin would say, you need to have dhawq, you need to have that dhawq for things, which is very important because you do need to have that to access the Quran, the Arabic language, our tradition, and even in other cultures and other poetry like Urdu, Persian that you've been mentioning, it is really important to engage with. Even English poetry, I would say, any form of poetry is a strong form of expression, and it's actually some of the greatest minds, they share their ideas through poetry. As you know, Sheikh, Sufi, a lot of the soul of spiritual ideas are shared through poetry and the experiences. So I think if you don't get into the poetry and read it, make an effort, you miss out on so much. And it explains, like the earlier question we had, maybe this kind of situation we find ourselves in because we've detached ourselves from that tradition. Thank you all again very much. Jazakumullah khairan. Take care.